Great, excellent. All right, bear with me as I get into presentation mode here. There we go. All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Management Grant Administration webinar. As Whitney mentioned, I am Corinne Johnson. I'm the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager here in Madison in the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. And I just want to congratulate all of you again on having been awarded an Urban Nonpoint Source Construction Grant. We're excited to provide you with this information today to help you in administering the grant through its life cycle. The webinar will provide answers to frequently asked questions, and we'll provide some tips to avoid problems, hopefully before they arise. We really want to try to prevent delays or complications, particularly with processing your reimbursement requests. So we'll dive in here. So, now that you've been awarded your grant, there are some key steps in the grant process that you need to be aware of. We're going to be reviewing each of these process steps, the grant agreement, required pre-approvals, the reimbursement request, amendments and variances, and the final report. As Whitney said, remember that the webinar is being recorded, so you can refer back to it. If you're at a particular step in the grant process, you should be able to find that step in the recording and review it. So it's our goal really to try to make the grant administration process as easy for you to navigate. So the first step in the process is the grant award or the grant agreement. All of you have received your award, and most of you have signed and returned your grant agreement, which is great. Some of you have a couple of you have sent it back with some questions about some of the conditions and some potential edits, and we're working on clarifying those with our legal staff. So we'll be getting back to you. But those of you, actually all of you, hopefully have taken the time to read your grant document thoroughly. And I encourage you to do that because your grant agreement serves as the foundation for your grant implementation and your funding eligibility. And, should you have any additional questions after today's presentation, we do have 8 regional Nonpoint Source coordinators across the state, along with staff here in Madison to help you out. Your regional Nonpoint coordinator is going to be your primary point of contact through the life of your project. And they are generally supported then by Madison staff as needed. And so if you take a look at the map here, pinpoint your county on the map, and you'll be able to then pinpoint who your regional Nonpoint coordinator is based on their county assignments. Okay, so moving on to the next step. Before you actually begin working on your construction project, there are some pre-approvals to be aware of. Trying to get my cursor in the right spot. There we go. Okay, so each of these different types of pre-approvals must be in writing in the form either in the grant award or a letter signed by an appropriate DNR staff person. First, if the grantee intends to request reimbursement for the use of force account in lieu of contracts for professional services or construction activities, this must be pre-approved by the DNR. Force account reimbursement means essentially reimbursement work done or reimbursement of work done by the grantee's own staff, particularly for engineering or construction. And the maximum allowable amount of force account reimbursement is 5% of the amount reimbursed for BMPs. Second, professional service agreements, professional service agreements for engineering services related to the design and the construction of the BMPs in your grant that you're planning to construct must be approved. Unlike the other items on this slide, though, this doesn't have to be pre-approved, it just has to be approved. And this is because DNR can reimburse engineering costs that are incurred prior to the start of the grant period if those engineering costs are for an installed BMP funded by the grant project. In such instances, the professional service agreements may be approved after they are executed, but they still do need to be approved. And throughout this presentation, we'll refer to these agreements for professional services, such as engineering agreements, as PSAs. So if you see the acronym PSA, that's what we're talking about. Third, DNR stormwater engineers must review construction plans and specifications for the things that are going to be done in the construction project before construction begins. Sometimes this is done at the same time as the stormwater permit review. However, even if the project doesn't require a stormwater permit, this step is still required. And again, it needs to be done before construction begins. And with land acquisitions, some of you may have land acquisitions as part of your grant award, land acquisition costs built into your grant. Land acquisition proposal and appraisal, those are required for a land acquisition component of your project. And these are actually two separate steps. And both of these approvals are required before you can proceed with that land acquisition. We're not going to go into more detail about those. We have really few grants where we're actually funding land acquisition based on requests for funding. But if you have questions about the land acquisition part of your grant, I encourage you to consult with your regional non-point coordinator. So just to point out two of these types of pre-approvals in particular, the two that are bolded are really ones that happen for almost every single Urban Nonpoint Source construction project. Whereas the first and the fourth one, like I said, are less common. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at the bolded ones. So, again, designs must receive department approval before construction begins. This was specified in the application instructions. It's also required per our administrative code. And it's also specified and reiterated in the grant agreement conditions. So we want you to really emphasize the fact that, and make the plea to you to not forget these steps. So getting those designs approved is critical. These are not new requirements, and we're not going to be able to reimburse you for those installed practices if the required approvals, particularly for the design and the construction specs, has not been done. So when a grantee submits their construction plans and specs for approval, again, it should be to a stormwater engineer. And currently our stormwater engineer her name is Amy Minzer in central office at DNR, is currently the engineer that's reviewing Urban Nonpoint grant related plans and specs. She would be the person that you submit them to. They will, well, in this case, Amy would be the one sending a letter to you with that approval, if they are approved. And so you'll receive a letter that looks something like this once those plans and specs are approved. And again, sometimes the approval of both the engineering professional service agreement and the plans and specs can be in the same letter. Sometimes the two are separate depending on the timing of things. This particular letter is an example of the two combined. Just note that, in order for this to be an official approval, it will be on DNR letterhead. It will reference the name of the project. It'll have the grant number. and it will be assigned, well, it will be signed by a stormwater engineer. In the case of, it would be Amy Minzer again in this case. So I just also want to reiterate that an email message or a verbal approval does not meet the program requirements. So you're going to really want to see a letter that looks like this one and save it for your records. And make sure that you have that approval before you get going with construction. And so we're going to zoom in just a little bit more in that letter, because it is that important. So the letter itself is going to first identify what is being approved, the plans, specifications, and bid documents. Next, the letter is going to identify the cost share rate and the maximum amount that can be reimbursed by the state for construction. It's right there. And since this letter approves both the construction plans and the engineering PSA, the letter also identifies the cost share rate and maximum amount that can be reimbursed by the state for engineering. And that's right there. Then there's various conditions of approval. It also states that engineering cannot be reimbursed until after the eligible practices are constructed. Funding for urban construction grant program comes from bond revenue. And so a condition of that state bond revenue from the bond council is that bond revenue can only be for engineering of constructed practices. So it's really important that you're not seeking reimbursement for engineering until those practices have actually been installed. And please don't assume that engineering costs will automatically be reimbursed. If you discover that a project cannot be permitted or a site is unsuitable for other reasons and the project is not built, DNR is not going to be able to reimburse you for those engineering costs, unfortunately. And again, this is a function of the sideboards on the bond revenue funding that is part of your grant. So we've unfortunately had cases where that's happened. Lastly, again, you're going to want to have that letter on letterhead and signed by that stormwater engineer. All right, I'm going to pause right there before we dive into the reimbursement. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that have come in, Corinne.
All right.
So the first one is on force account approval. Would contracting with our county highway department be considered force account if our department pays or contracts with the highway department? T&M expenses and invoicing.
It depends on who's asking the question. If you are a county and you're having essentially county staff do the work, then that would be force account. If you're a city, town, village, and you're contracting with the county, it's almost like they're a contractor in that case. It's not your own staff, because they're doing the work via a contract. So no, that would not be force account in that case.
Okay. What was the percent restriction on local force account work?
The percent restriction is 5. And again, it's set by the State Bond Council. So force account can't exceed 5% of the amount spent on the grant award for BMPs. So if the grant, the state share amount. So if the state share amount for a BMP is $100,000, the force account could not exceed 5% of that. So that'd be $5,000. And we can't reimburse on the force account again until the final reimbursement. So we have to know that BMP was fully installed. We know the total cost. We know what the state share amount is. And then we can use that state share amount to determine what the 5% amount is as the force account cap.
Okay. We have another question. It says, we worked with the DNR previously and have already purchased the property. We were told that we could be reimbursed for the property acquisition if the closing date, mid-June 2020, is within 1 year of the grant award. How do we request approvals for something that has already occurred?
That's a good question. Because we don't do very much property acquisition, I'm going to have to look into the code on this. But you are correct. Property acquisition can happen prior to the grant award, and there are steps specified in code in terms of having an appraisal done. And still having a property acquisition plan reviewed. There's still things that still have to happen. Even though that acquisition has happened previously, DNR still will need to review certain documents. And you will be able to then ultimately seek reimbursement on that property acquisition once the practices are installed. We will not be able to reimburse on that acquisition until the associated practices for which the acquisition was necessary have actually been installed. So I would ask that, depending on who's asking the question, that your regional non-point coordinator and I maybe get together and we talk specifically about that. Because that's an even less often happening situation where we have an acquisition that's done prior to the grant award. It's just a little bit trickier of a situation, but we can get through it by working together on it.
Great. We have a clarification question here. So force account is if our own employees are doing the work versus contractors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. I think that is all the questions we have right now. So just as a reminder, we are using the chat feature and you could direct your questions to the Q&A, Joanna Griffin. I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. This is everybody's favorite part of the webinar. Favorite part of the grant process is compiling and sending in your reimbursement requests and getting your grant money. So we're going to dive into the reimbursement request portion of the webinar. So again, we're going to walk through the procedures on how to fill out the reimbursement request. Sometimes you'll hear it as the request for reimbursement or the RFR or the reimbursement request, all mean the same thing. Not surprisingly, we have a form for that. Form 8700-336 is our reimbursement request form. We'll provide some examples and some helpful hints to you on how to properly fill out that form and have a successful reimbursement request. So I'm going to catch up with my speaker notes here. So to start out, some of you may ask, well, why do we have to provide all this information and fill out all these various parts of the reimbursement request? And, the answer largely is essentially fiscal accountability, essentially documenting that the state money that's being spent in these projects is being spent in accordance with rules, statutes, and the various funding requirements. I've talked a little bit about, bond council requirements. I can say that essentially all of the Urban Nonpoint Source construction grants are funded solely with bond revenue. So we've got these funding requirements at play. And, it's really important too that we have information because DNR's got various reporting requirements associated with these funding sources. Not to mention having to be ready for audits that happen for state funding programs. And so it's really important that you clearly label and do the necessary math in tables 1 and 2 of the form that you're going to see coming up. And so when can a reimbursement request be submitted? When should it be submitted? So, in terms of construction projects, reimbursement requests can only be submitted for fully installed, fully constructed BMPs. And not until at least one BMP has been fully installed. So if you've got a reimbursement request, or excuse me, a grant that has 3 BMPs included in the scope of work, you could seek reimbursement if one of the 3 BMPs has been fully installed. But not until that point. And so that in essence would be considered a partial reimbursement, because only a part of the process or part of the project had been implemented at that point. But that one BMP has to be fully constructed. And then ultimately, you definitely need to get a reimbursement in as your final request. Your final reimbursement must be submitted no later than 60 days at the end of the grant period, after the end of the grant period. So for those of you that maybe have active construction projects right now, or have applied and been awarded in the past, that's generally March 1st, after the end of your grant expiration date. And for those of you that do have land acquisition, whether it be fee title, I think in most cases it is fee title as opposed to easement. I just do want to point out that recording fees are eligible for reimbursement. And you should use BMP code R115 when requesting reimbursement for anything associated with any kind of deed work. But I do want to point out that in general, permit fees, attorney fees, environmental cleanup costs, brokerage fees, real estate transfer tax fees, taxes, those are not reimbursable. And that is specified in Chapter NR 155, if I didn't say it already, which is our governing administrative code for urban nonpoint grants. So just some key points to remember. All design costs to be reimbursed are to be for the design of constructed BMPs included in the grant agreement. We can't cover the design costs for something other than a BMP that's in the grant agreement. And all design costs to be reimbursed need to have been incurred either before or during the grant period. We do have the ability to cover design work that was done prior to the grant award, as long as those BMPs in fact do get constructed. The actual construction costs to be reimbursed need to be incurred during the grant period. They can't happen before and they can't happen after the grant period. The construction has to happen during the grant period. And the amount of reimbursement requested for construction and engineering activities cannot exceed their respective budget lines in the grant agreement. If you look at the first page of your grant agreement, you'll see that there's a budget line for construction. And if you asked for engineering costs, there would be a separate budget line for engineering. And those serve as caps then essentially for those grant activities. All construction costs to be reimbursed are for BMPs and any ancillary activities that have been completely installed. So just want to kind of reinforce that again, that we're looking for BMPs that are done and ready to roll in implementation. Okay, so again, I hinted at this already. When can I request a partial reimbursement? Again, reimbursement can only be requested when that BMP is fully installed. And if you got more than one BMP in your grant and you fully completed one of them, that BMP can be reimbursed. So if you want to get grant funding flowing to at least cover that part of your project, we can get the reimbursement. You can seek reimbursement for that one BMP. Okay, we're going to touch on force account a little bit more. I'm glad we already had some questions, but we'll dive into the details a little bit more. So again, force account is that the use of the grantee's own employees or equipment for project planning, design, construction related activities, inspection, repair, and so on and so on. And it's defined in code. Only urban nonpoint construction applicants can apply for force account as opposed to urban planning grantees. Some of you may have been previous, in fact, I know you have been, are previous or active planning grantees. Again, talking about the 5% cap on that amount, and the fact that it may only be sought with the final grant reimbursement request. Now, the code does say that you need to secure prior written approval from the department. In essence, your approval ends up being the budget line item in your grant award. So if you were awarded force account, it's been approved. It's in your grant, it's been approved. Okay, so now diving into the details of the reimbursement form itself. You know, as you look at Form 8700 336, and start to fill it out, I would request that you take as much information as you can to populate the form from your grant agreement. And essentially, we're just looking to keep the information that's in your grant agreement and then in your reimbursement request as consistent as possible, so that there's no confusion about what you said you were going to do in the grant award versus what you actually did. We want to try to see that that's consistent. The form is available on the Urban Nonpoint Source website, on the DNR website. And you can always try to download that RFR from that website, and so that you can ensure that you're always getting the most current version of that form. So each time you do a reimbursement request, I would recommend that you go to the website and download the most current form rather than storing it somewhere. Make sure that you get that most current version. And we do have an instruction document and checklist that's on the reimbursement tab of the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website. Okay, so diving into the details a bit. First off, you can see the grant information section contains information that identifies the grantee name and the address for where reimbursement checks should be mailed. And this should be consistent with, again, information that you provided when you sent in your grant award and provided that grantee contact page, specifying who would the address that would receive checks. The grant project name, your grant number that was assigned by DNR should be included here. The applicable cost share percentage, cost share rate, and your pay request number should be reflected in this section. And then lastly, you're going to want to note whether or not this is a partial or a final reimbursement request. The program type. In your case, you're going to click the Urban Nonpoint Source Construction button, and then the period that's covered by the request, which essentially should cover work within the grant period. It should be reflecting work that is only done within the grant period. And just a reminder too, we're going to talk about this, that, you know, along with your final reimbursement, you will need to submit your final report, and your final reimbursement cannot be processed until we've received and approved that final report. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we move forward. So just a reminder on some tips for that reimbursement. Download that current form. Get your cost share rate from your grant agreement, because that is the rate that is being applied for any reimbursement in your grant. And that's where you're going to put it again, your applicable cost share rate. And, you know, it talked about, you know, including information from your grant contact page. And get that, again, that grant time period. Make sure that it's for work that was done within the grant agreement period. You know, if you have an invoice that's dated after the grant period, specify the date in which the work was completed. And again, that installation or that construction work should be actually done during the grant period. Okay, so here we're looking a little bit farther down page 1. This is the payment information section, which is in the middle of the page of page 1, and it provides a summary of the current payment record and grant balance. The grant financial data includes the total grant award, payments the grantee has received to date, and grant funds remaining. And so in the blue highlighted area, you'll see that you as the grantee must enter the grant award amount, which is listed on your grant agreement, and the total prior reimbursement amounts. The pink cell contains the reimbursement request total, and this is auto-populated from table 1 on page 2 of the form, and it cannot be overwritten. The green grant balance remaining amount is also auto-populated and is calculated based on the amounts entered above it. And then this area over to the right that's highlighted yellow is for DNR, specifically me, to use when processing your reimbursement. And last on page 1, there's a certification section. And this is required to be completed by the grantee's authorized representative. Notice I did not say the grantee's consultant. So just want to be very clear that it's the authorized governmental official that will certify that the information is true and correct. And this authorized government official needs to be consistent with your authorizing resolution for the project. And if you have any questions about that, you can certainly consult with your regional non-point coordinator on that. But generally in your authorizing resolution, we typically encourage people to put a job title in as opposed to a person's name. So if there's changes over time with your authorizing or with your staff, if there's staff changes, as long as the job title is still current, you won't need to change your resolution with those staff changes. And just want to remind folks that, if you do have any changes you need to make to your GRR or GAR, sometimes the GRR meaning the responsibility resolution, we do have a template for this on DNR's website. And if you need to make any updates to it, this template is available to you. But I think at this point, everybody at this point that has submitted their grants has an up-to-date authorizing resolution. All right, so let's move on to table 2, or excuse me, page 2 of the reimbursement request form. You'll notice that there's tables 1 and table 2. And we're going to go over this in a little bit more detail because this is where things can get a little bit tricky, and just to make sure that you understand each section of this form. So starting with table 1, the following information must be provided. The name of the cost share recipient, and in this case, that's you the grantee. If you're the one essentially doing work on construction work, BMP construction work on property that is within your jurisdiction, and it is essentially your project, you are that cost share recipient as the grantee for this particular type of grant. The activity to be completed is essentially going to be the BMPs that you're installing, and you select from the DNR BMP code list here. This is a drop down. It'll auto-populate the activity or practice being installed, the number of units completed for that particular practice, the total expense, the reimbursement request amount. So you're going to have the total expense, your cost share percentage, your cost share rate, based on that cost share rate, the eligible cost share. But in some cases, the reimbursement request, the amount that you're actually seeking for reimbursement may or may not be equal or the same as the eligible state share. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then very far to the right, there's a question about practice complete, yes or no. And really, in the case of urban construction grants, we should never really see a no button clicked. We are going to want to see a yes button clicked as certification that the practice is in fact completely installed. So with table 1, again, it's going to be use the municipality that received the grant, receiving the cost sharing. You're going to use that drop-down list to pick your practice. And each BMP should get a separate row. So again, if you've got 3 BMPs in your grant, you're going to essentially fill out 3 separate rows in table 1. And it would be expected that if that's what you're seeking reimbursement for, each BMP for which reimbursement is sought should have a separate row in table 1. Again, if you want to seek reimbursement for any one BMP that's been fully installed, that's fine too. All right, just want to provide some additional tips in filling this out. You will see that in this particular example, I still happen to have some planning deliverables, but they too are treated like practices. They each have BMP codes, so bear with me on that. First, whether it's planning activities or construction activities, again, each BMP needs to have a separate line. They cannot be combined, and by default, you're going to have to select one BMP code per line. Again, just a reiteration of that. The yellow cell over here for reimbursement request is gonna be what you're specifying as the amount of reimbursement that you're seeking. And in the case of this particular example, reimbursement request is matching the eligible cost share. You're not going to be, you can't seek reimbursement request for an amount that's greater than in the eligible state cost share. Just remember that. But you can ask for less than the eligible state share. And, I would ask that, in your proofs of purchase, if it's invoices, which is the most common proof of purchase, it's really helpful to notate the BMPs on the proof of purchase. And it just makes it easier to process and faster to not have to try to guess, in a given invoice, which BMP that's attributed to, especially when you have multiple practices for which you're seeking reimbursement. And in cases where you have an invoice that has maybe multiple practices reflected, but only one of them is eligible to be reimbursed, again, putting a notation on the invoice of what's eligible and what's not, breaking out those costs, whether you do it on the invoice or you create a separate spreadsheet to show the breakout of those eligible and ineligible costs, that's really helpful. And again, it makes it so much faster for me to be able to finish processing your reimbursement, and leaves no guesswork as to what invoice is paying for which practices. And then, the one thing I want to mention too is, for urban construction grants, there's often a larger project that is being constructed, not necessarily just the one that is the portion being funded by the urban stormwater grant. If you've got a larger project, let's say it involves doing road construction and you're working on stormwater related activities, in terms of project cost, only eligible activities should really be reflected in table 1. It shouldn't be things that are attributed to that larger project, since those costs are ineligible anyway. So then moving on to table 2, this is where you actually take that reimbursement documentation and spell out the details of that. So each invoice needs to be entered for each BMP. Additional lines can be added to table 2 by selecting the plus sign that's on the far right hand side. It's kind of on my screen, it's hidden by the little zoom windows. But you can add more rows if you need to. Oftentimes we see, multiple invoices in a given reimbursement request. So again, all sections in table 2, again, in a given row will need to be filled in. You've got your invoice or proof of purchase, or proof of purchase reflected. Most cases, it is an invoice that we see. The green section is the document number. Typically, that's the invoice number. And if there is no invoice number, you can just put the invoice date in that cell. After selecting who the payee is in terms of the contractor doing the work that issued the invoice, you're going to pick a BMP code, and that BMP code must be selected from the drop down. And essentially, we want to see that there's a BMP code in table 2 that goes ultimately with a BMP then in table 1. So we're going to be looking between the 2 tables to make sure that the invoices are corresponding with the list of practices for which reimbursement is being sought. Again, the DNR funding amount in table 2, it's going to be the dollar amount for reimbursement being requested. So for a given invoice, you're going to be, this is an amount based on what you're actually requesting, not what is necessarily eligible. So it's going to tie in with your reimbursement request up in table 1, and I'll show you how that corresponds. So if you're, for the amount of the remaining balance of a given practice, the non-DNR funding amount, the amount that would not be reimbursed by DNR, is then put in the cell that is shaded blue in this case. And then in the pink cells, or orangey pink cells, you're going to put what the non-DNR funding source was, and that does need to be completed. It could be you as the landowner, the municipality, or some other funding source that you maybe have, or some other grant program. Depends on that funding situation, but we want to know what the other non-DNR funding source was. So, the total amounts of DNR and non-DNR funding, as well as the grand total amount, are calculated and auto-populated at the bottom of table 2. So you can see that right here. The proof of purchase documentation amounts in table 2 should be reconciled with the amounts claimed in table 1. So we'll break this down a little bit. So the proof of purchase grand total amount in table 2, $90,000, should equal the total BMP expenses claimed in table 1, as noted by those yellow circles. The total DNR funding amount, in terms of the amount that is being requested from DNR in table 2, right here, the blue circle, should match the blue circle, the total reimbursement request, up in table 1. So you can see how those amounts correspond. So you're going to want to make sure that proofs of purchase are included for all state cost share amounts to be reimbursed. Like I said, it's most commonly that we see invoices being that proof of purchase, but there are other acceptable methods that are listed in the drop downs. The document number, is the invoice. That is the invoice number. So if you don't have an invoice, use that date again. Let's see here. The one thing you need to remember is that each BMP code selected in table 2 must be able to correspond with a BMP code up in table 1. And each proof of purchase needs to be a separate line. And the one thing I didn't actually show in this particular example is if you have an invoice that has 2 practices reflected in it, you're going to need to mention that invoice twice. So, let's say if invoice 252452 actually had 2 practices in it, you would have two rows, one that would be for that same invoice. One would spell out the cost for U12 and one would spell out the cost for, say, U8, if both of those practices were included in that invoice. So I just want to make a point of mentioning that. And let me just go back so you can take a look at that. Trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it. Just make sure that essentially you can, again, reconcile those BMP costs down here with the BMP costs up here. Okay, so then for those of you that have, again, have force account as a budget line item in your grant, you are going to be required to fill out the force account certification form with each reimbursement. And this is a form that is available on the DNR webpage. And let me get to the right, my notes again here. It's form 8700-353. And again, it's on the reimbursement tab of the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website. And it's a fairly easy form to fill out, but essentially what this does is provides documentation for your municipality's staff time done on the project. And we talked a lot about force account already in terms of what it is, but in filling out the form, you're going to start with part A. It's pretty self-explanatory in terms of your basic information about your municipality. And you're going to, when you've got your own labor being involved in the project, you're going to click the button for the force account labor worksheet. And that's going to activate part C of the form, which is over here. For now, you're going to skip part B. So you'll essentially outline the various employees that worked on the project, provide the necessary hourly wage and hours and so on for the time that they spent on the project. And it'll give you essentially a grand total then of the salary that was spent on the project. And then going back then to part B, it will auto-populate that information, and you'll be able to apply. It'll automatically auto-populate your cost share percentage, which you added up here. So you'll be able to see that in this example, there was $540 of salary costs spent on the project for force account, and that particular project had a cost share rate of 66%. Meaning that $356.40 right here, I know it's a little small, is eligible to be reimbursed. And the one thing I will say is once you fill out this form, and this is going to accompany your reimbursement request form, you need to make sure that you carry this amount, these amounts, the total. Obviously, you're going to be applying the cost share rate and then the eligible amount to your reimbursement form. So we essentially treat force account almost as if it's a BMP, and you're going to use BMP code R54. It's in the drop-down list along with all the other BMP codes, and you're going to want to make sure that you reflect that on your reimbursement form in order to be reimbursed for force account. So this form documents who was doing the work, how much it cost, and then to seek reimbursement, you reflect that amount then on your reimbursement form. And just like with most things, I'm going to have a check-in, especially if it's a partial reimbursement, on the project status. There's a small project status section there to give us a sense of how the project is progressing if you're mid-course. Tell us about any problems or delays you may be having with the project. And then move on to the project installation verification. And you're going to need to have a representative from your governmental unit to go in and check that the project has been installed in accordance with the appropriate standards and specifications, and provide the name of that person that did that inspection. And then last but not least, we have a section that's for DNR use only. And that is where our regional non-point source coordinators will sign off. They will be the ones that will receive your reimbursement form. You will email it to them. They will review it first before sending it on to me here in Madison to then process it. If they give their thumbs up, then I can continue processing it. So at this point, just leave that section, that last section blank. And here I will pause for questions because I know that the reimbursement form can often generate questions.
Great. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. And just as a reminder, you can ask your questions through the chat box. First one is, any issue with only applying for one / final reimbursement at the end of the project, or should reimbursement be requested with each quarterly report?
This is a difference between planning and construction. I think in general, with planning projects, we like to see quarterly reimbursement requests coming in. And it's different with planning because you may not have a planning product done yet, and it's okay to do that. It's okay to come in for reimbursement. But with construction projects, you can't necessarily do that because, like I've said, you have to have at least one fully installed BMP in order to seek reimbursement. So, while you have a 2-year grant period, obviously, if you get one of 3 practices installed, we certainly would like to see you come in with a reimbursement request for the one practice that you got installed. I think it always looks good for you and for DNR, the state, the program, to show that we're getting the money spent, because then the legislature knows that we're getting work done, all of us collectively. So, to answer your question, no, we're not expecting quarterly reimbursement requests with construction projects. If you get a practice done, sure, send in a reimbursement request. But if your project has one practice and it doesn't happen to be installed until, let's say, the last quarter of your grant period, your 2-year grant period, that's okay. We understand some of these projects take time to install. Obviously, we always promote the sooner the better, but we do understand that they take time. And so, no, we're not expecting quarterly reimbursement requests. In fact, like I said before, the bond council wouldn't allow that.
Sounds good. Regarding the forms, I noticed that some of them do not open in Chrome. They will open in Internet Explorer, but not Chrome or Safari. Can your tech folks look into this?
If you only knew. Yes, and thank you for mentioning that. We at the staff level here have the same frustrations. We're at the mercy of our forms developers it's a department-wide crew of staff that develop forms throughout the agency. And we're essentially at the mercy of them and the technology that they use. And yes, we have broached that issue. But it's really good to point out that if you're going to be opening DNR forms, yes, do it in Internet Explorer. I happen to be a Chrome lover. I use Chrome all the time, but I do have to keep Explorer as an active button to be able to open up DNR forms. So we hear you. I will point out it's a ways off, but DNR is working towards an e-grants system. I think we'll still be dealing with, to some extent, it'll be web-based, but it will still be using fillable PDFs to some extent. But that may alleviate some of the issues in terms of browsers, potentially. It's probably a couple years off before that system is up and running yet. But yeah, that was just a long-winded answer for saying we hear you and we apologize for that inconvenience.
All right. Do local force account restrictions apply to the matching funds as well, or just the grant funds?
The force account, so I understand, the force account restrictions that I was talking about is essentially the activities that can be reimbursed with the force account funding. So again, it's going to be your staff time doing the various things that I mentioned that were eligible. Usually it's design work, or maybe it's, you know, actual labor to install a portion of the practice. Those are the restrictions, you know. So if it's your municipality doing, you know, employees doing that work, then the cost share rate is essentially applied 70% up to that 5% cap, based on the BMP state share. So yeah, there still is a local share associated with that. So, you know, you are capped at that 5%, and there's going to be a portion of that municipal staff time that's going to have to come from some other funding source. And I'm in most cases, I'm assuming it comes from your municipal coffers. So I hope I answered your question. But, you know, again, force account is, you know, there are sideboards on what that means, and what are eligible activities. It's not consultant time. It's not, but it has a cost share rate and it has a cap.
Sounds good. We did some preliminary design in order to assess the validity of the land acquisition and have been working on the final design since the grant was awarded. Will that be a problem for reimbursement?
Say it again. Read it again.
Yep. We did preliminary design in order to assess the validity of the land acquisition and have been working on the final design since the grant was awarded. Will that be a problem for reimbursement?
No. As I mentioned, design work done prior to the grant award is eligible for reimbursement. You still have to go through the approval process to have designs and specs approved by Amy, you know, by a stormwater engineer, even though that work was done prior to the grant award. So it's still, you know, hopefully going to be an eligible, you know, it will still be an eligible expense. Obviously, we want to see designs done that are consistent with applicable technical standards, and that's going to be the kind of thing that Amy's looking for. But the fact that it was done prior, and that work ties into the design work you're doing now, that's fine.
Okay. Can you pay local force account from match funds and have them be eligible match?
Almost like in-kind services, maybe. Let me check on that. I think that there are some specifications in the code in NR 155 about in-kind services or in-kind match. I'm going to probably have to get back to you on that. That doesn't happen a lot, in terms of attributing that almost, yeah, like you said, as match, that force account work is match. I think it might be possible. I just have to refresh my memory on the code wording, so we can get back to you on that.
Sounds good. For projects that include BMPs as part of a larger project, for example, with other park features, do the BMP related design costs have to be specifically itemized in the invoices? Or can the grantee propose a percentage division based on total dollar amount of the project or some other method? It's kind of a long question, so I can repeat it if you need me to.
Yeah, repeat it again.
Yeah. For projects that include BMPs as part of a larger project, for example, with other park features, do the BMP related design costs have to be specifically itemized in the invoices? Or can the grantee propose a percentage division based on total dollar amount of the project or some other method?
That's a good question. Obviously, to the extent possible, we would want them to try to be itemized, but I get what you're saying. If there's design work being done for this larger project and the BMPs are part of it, how do you parse out the part that's attributed to the BMPs, I think that's where you, like you said, almost like prorating out the amount of the design that's attributed to the BMPs. Let me get back to you on that one too. I think that there probably is a way that you would be able to do that in terms of pulling out an estimated, percentage of that design work. This too, again, is not a question that we get or that we see very often. Usually we see a design done for a specific practice, and then it's clearly identified. So it's a little bit trickier situation. It's a little bit grayer. So we can look into that more definitively.
All right. Yeah, I'm seeing a follow-up to that question, and they're saying, right, such as overall site grading as an example of what they might be discussing. But yeah, I think that wraps up the questions we had for that section. And just as a reminder that the people who we have follow-up questions, we are taking down names for all of these questions. So we will be able to follow up with you after the webinar. So thanks for the questions, and thanks, Corinne. We'll turn it back to you.
Okay, we'll keep moving forward here. I think in general the reimbursement section is one of the more difficult sections, or tricky sections in terms of complexity. So right now we're going to move on to amendments and variances. There's certainly over the life of your project, there's going to be times when things change. You realize that there may be something associated with your project that isn't reflected in your grant agreement that somehow needs to be modified. And so we're going to talk a bit more about how you go about modifying your grant, having your grant modified, and continuing to ensure that it's consistent or provides an exception to what is in our administrative code. So first and foremost here, what is a grant amendment? A grant amendment is essentially a change to one or more conditions of your grant agreement. In terms of when should you request an amendment, you definitely need to request any grant amendment before the end of the grant period, as soon as possible, I would say. So, before you take any action or incur any kind of project cost that appears to be inconsistent with your current grant agreement, get a request for an amendment in before you take that action and do that work. Because if it's not in your grant, it's not eligible for reimbursement. So there may be times when you're going to have to incur a project cost that maybe wasn't reflected in your grant agreement, or is in many cases, more so often we see that there may be a project cost that's in excess of a budget line in your grant agreement, and you'd like to see that changed. If you're adding or eliminating, and unfortunately I still have planning deliverable in here, I apologize, I should say construction of BMP, that should be changed. That grant should be amended. So you definitely want to make sure that you request an amendment in that case. And then, if you're changing the location of a practice, you're going to want to make sure that you change have the grant amended to reflect a change in the location. All right, so we're going to go through the different types of grant amendments. First off, I think the most common type that we see is a grant amendment associated with extending the grant period. First and foremost, I think that make sure that you get this request in well before your grant ends. In the case of construction grants, these are 2-year grants. You do have the ability to request a 1-year extension. We generally like to see these types of amendment requests come in before mid-November at the end of your grant period. Your grant ends generally December 31st of a given year. So we'd like to see it at least 45 days before your grant ends. Next category is a budget amendment. I mentioned before that, if you want to try to increase the amount in a given budget line, you're going to want to request an amendment in that case. Maybe you have more money devoted to engineering versus construction, and you realize that construction is going to cost more than you thought, and so you'd like to see money put from engineering to construction. You're going to need an amendment in that case. And again, with a scope amendment, this is the case of adding, removing, or replacing practices, or changing the location of your practices. That is definitely going to need an amendment. And if you have an issue with your project that doesn't necessarily fit into one of these groups, you're best off consulting with your regional non-point coordinator and talking through that potential change to your project. Sometimes changes in projects can be kind of gray and doesn't necessarily don't fall into one of these boxes. So, the sooner you can do that, the better. And this is what the amendment form, the front page of the amendment form looks like. The kind of the table in the middle of the first page. What you're seeing here is it's Form 8700-308, and this is on the DNR website under the Resources tab for the grant program. And when you want to request an amendment, you're going to need to fill out Part A. And it's going to ask you questions just about your general grant project status. But then it's going to ask questions that are going to help you and help us know what kind of amendment you need. So you'll answer these various questions. And based on that, it will then populate Part C and tell us the type of amendment that's being requested. And so here you can see an actual completed example, and you can see that Part C has been filled in. So based on the questions and how they were answered, you can see here that this particular grantee is going to be in need of an extension amendment and a scope amendment. And even if this form gives you if it gives you no yeses, essentially, for lack of a better way to say it, you may still want to contact your regional non-point coordinator, because again, if you are suspecting that there's a change in your project that's not consistent with your grant, and you still get no yeses here in the red, it's still really good to talk with your coordinator about those changes. And then once you fill in the necessary remaining parts of the form, if it tells you that you need an extension or a scope amendment, there's going to be additional parts of the form that are going to allow you to elaborate on why it's needed, what's going on with the project that justifies the need for that amendment. And once you fill out the form, you're going to be sending this to your regional non-point source coordinator. They'll take a look at it and look at it in the context of your grant. And if they approve of it, then they'll send it on down to our grants team in central office, and we'll take a look at it and decide whether or not to approve it. And then if it's approved, I will actually move forward and process it. Extension amendments are generally going to be a letter to you, essentially saying that the time extension was granted. Other kinds of amendments, particularly scope and budget amendments, are going to be an actual amendment document that you're going to need to sign and return to the DNR. So with variances, sometimes no matter, what you do in your project, again, things may change. And there may be times where, depending on what's going on in your project, there may be some facet of it that's necessary, but it maybe it's not consistent exactly with what's required in code. So what is a variance? In the case of your grants, it's essentially an approved exception to the administrative code. And again, the applicable codes for your grants are Chapter NR 154 and 155. So when is a variance allowed? Essentially for that variant, for a given variance to be allowed, it needs to be essential to implementing your grant project and meeting those water quality objectives that you talked about in your grant application. And it really needs to be, in order to be approved, it needs to be in the best interest of the program. It can't be something that's kind of way out in left field. And when is a variance not allowed? I will say that DNR cannot grant any variances that are from statutory requirements. And the one thing I forgot to put on this slide is 281.66 of the Wisconsin statutes is the guiding statute for the Urban Nonpoint Source Grant Program. It's 281.66 for those of you that like reading statutes. So if it's something that you see in code that is also specified in statute, we're not going to be able to issue a variance. And I think that the most common type of variance that we see in the Urban Nonpoint Construction Grant Program is asking for a time extension for your grant period that's beyond the maximum. Like I said before, your grants are 2-year grants. You're allowed a 1-year extension. Under some circumstances, in some cases, we will approve variances to go past the 3 years. And that's pretty much the most common type that we see. So in terms of how you do this, again, there is a DNR approval step here. You're going to need to submit a written request to the DNR, citing the specific section or subsection of the administrative code from which the variance is being requested. You're going to have to provide some justification for that variance in that written request. There should be some good cause, or circumstances beyond your control, or maybe some financial hardship issues that are justifying why you need the variance. And then on DNR's end, like I mentioned, our grants team will review it. We're going to review it in the context of your project, in terms of how you're going to be able to continue to implement your project and meet your water quality objectives, and look at it in the context of the program as a whole. And if it's approved, then you'll see that that variance request approved in the form of a letter. But in terms of how you structure it, we just got a little description here of how to structure it. Your actual request doesn't need to be a master's thesis by any stretch, and it can be pretty simple and to the point. So you can see some template language versus an actual example. Most often the delays that we see in projects are due to Mother Nature, and delays in conditions for construction. So getting back to the approval process, so when is a variance officially approved and in effect? Like I said, you will receive a letter or a grant amendment. In the case of a time extension variance, it will be a letter. In the case of a scope or budget amendment, it will be a grant amendment. And it will be signed by the Bureau Director of Community Financial Assistance, or it'll be signed by me on behalf of the Bureau Director. In terms of when a variance is not in effect, I will point out that an email from DNR staff stating that they recommend approval of the request, that is not an approved variance. Sometimes regional staff will copy you on the email. They'll copy you on the email to central office, essentially saying that they recommend approval. That's not the end step. Getting that letter or that grant amendment from me, or again, the Bureau Director from Community Financial Assistance is that last step. And it's going to look something like this. The new Mary Rose Tevis, the former Bureau Director, retired not too long ago, and the new Bureau Director is Jim Ritchie. So you'll see Jim Ritchie's name at the bottom of these letters now. But just know that it will be an official document, as opposed to a more informal email. So I think we'll keep moving forward and save questions then for the final section after talking about the final report. So when is a final report required? The answer to that is for every Urban Nonpoint grant. So when you're done with your project, essentially we'll need to see a final report, essentially telling the story of what you did, what you accomplished and were able to construct or install with the grant funds. It should be submitted with the final reimbursement request once your project is completed. And as I said before, that final report and final reimbursement request should be submitted no later than 60 days after your grant expires, which is around March 1st. And I do want to point out, it's not ready yet, but we hopefully coming soon, potentially within the next year, you're going to see a new way to submit your final report. So we're going to go through the content of the final report a bit. It's currently the usual fillable PDF form. But the department is developing a BMP implementation tracking system. The first part of this data system that we've developed is for a program called the multi-discharger variants. And it helping track practices that are implemented through that program. It's a kind of a partnership program between wastewater dischargers and county land conservation staff in terms of the flow of funding. But we needed a tracking system for in general for tracking non-point source related or stormwater related practices. And so eventually we'll be in touch with you all about being able to submit your final report content through a web-based, GIS-based data system. So, in general, whether you're doing it via the PDF form or ultimately through BITS, the BMP implementation tracking system, this is a general list of what we expect and what we want you to share. What BMPs were ultimately constructed, what pollutants were reduced by those BMPs, and how much were they reduced. Essentially, looking to see that the project was implemented according to the grant agreement and is ultimately consistent with the statutes and codes and the funding requirements. So it tells the story of what you did all in one place and just look to make sure that the project was implemented according to the grant agreement. And right now the final report form is on the DNR website. You can see the resources tab. When you go to the Urban Nonpoint page, there's these different tabs, and under the resources tab you'll see that the final report is listed there. There's instructions as well as the form, and just want to remind everybody to please read the instructions. It'll help ensure that you've got all the necessary information in your report, and it will speed up getting that final reimbursement out to you. So really quickly, we're going to run through the content of the form. The grant information section is pretty self-explanatory in terms of the basics regarding you, the municipality that got the grant. There's site location information, and if your grant had more than one site, the form does allow you to add sites, and you'll be expected to essentially provide this information that you see here for each site applicable to your project. Again, if you're essentially developing or constructing one practice, say a wet detention basin, you essentially are probably going to have one site. I can't imagine that you would have multiple for one wet detention basin. So you'll only be expected to fill it out for that one site. But the good thing is you can add multiple sites to this one form. So if you do have multiple sites, you will have one report encompassing all of those sites. The site location information is pretty straightforward. Looking at your the HUC 12, the hydrologic unit code that your project, your practices sit in, the nearest water body to your project location, and then the primary water body that was addressed by the project. And usually this is that water body for which you got lots of points in the water quality need question of your application. It may be an impaired water body or an exceptional resource water that was really the driving water body for the water quality goals in your project. Everybody installing practices is going to need to specify those practices. The surface area associated with the practices. Each practice is going to go on an individual line here. And you can add more rows if you've got more than 2 practices. And so you can see here, these are the eligible practices and their associated technical standards for urban construction grants. You saw this same list of practices in your grant application. You check the associated box for the practices that you're planning to install. And so the associated technical standards are there for your reference. So getting back to the table here, the form, you're going to be required to fill in each of these cells for each BMP and essentially specify the load reductions achieved for the applicable pollutants addressed by the project. And then for the model that you use, we're going to want to know which model you did in fact use for your load reduction modeling. So check that model and the method that you used. And over to the far right, hopefully you can see this on your screen. We're looking for the total BMP cost plus any ancillary activities associated with that BMP. Notice I didn't say the award amount. We are looking for the total cost here. Kind of looking at that cost benefit analysis of the load reductions versus the total cost associated with that BMP. Do not include larger project costs. If there were project costs, again, completely unrelated to the construction of the BMP or those ancillary activities, do not include those other project costs. Like I said, if you're doing a road construction project and you've got practices that you were installing as part of that, stormwater practices that you were installing as part of that project, you're not going to include the road construction in that BMP cost. And you may not be able to see the title of this slide, but it's just a reminder of eligible ancillary activities, so in terms of the total cost of your BMP, just a reminder of the different kinds of ancillary activities that you may see as included in your grant award, some of them as separate line items in your grant. And then with each site, there's going to be associated attachments that we're going to need that provide a little more details about that site. Things such as pre and post implementation photos, your load reduction modeling documentation, an aerial photo map of the site with those BMPs labeled, a reiteration that you have control over the property. We would expect that you would going in and then also coming out of the implementation of the project. And then if you committed to water quality monitoring in your grant application, the eventual water quality monitoring results should also be attached. And like I said, if you have multiple project sites, the form does allow you to add more locations. So you can click that location button to add more sites. And then you'd be expected to provide the same list of information for each of the sites. So, some of you may be scratching your heads, what really qualifies as a site in terms of knowing how many sites you're going to need to report on. Like I said, if you got one BMP, you essentially have a single site. If you have more than one BMP, then you should kind of evaluate, are those BMPs on the same parcel or no. If they're not on the same parcel, then you've got multiple project sites. If they're in different HUC 12s, if they drain to different HUC 12s, then you probably have multiple project sites. If the BMPs serve the same source area, and if they don't serve the same source area, excuse me, you've got multiple project sites. So just keep that in mind, depending on the structure of your project and the practices you're installing. And last but not least, on the form, you got the usual grantee certification. And here again, we are expecting that the authorized government official is the one signing the form or inserting their name and title into the form and dating the form. If you decide to type the name and title in, the final report does need to be received via the email address, via the email account, directly from that government official. So it's not a consultant, it's not a staff person. It's going to have to be from that authorized government official, consistent with your authorizing resolution. And just a reminder there to make sure that it's in fact that person. And then lastly, just want to remind everybody that you should stay in touch with your regional non-point coordinator. If you've got questions about your project implementation, please do get in touch with them early and often. We would rather that you ask questions than be told that something's not eligible for reimbursement. They're there to help you and try to make this process as seamless as possible. So again, take note of who that person is. And I guess I'll open it up for questions at this point.
All right, we've got a question in. If the project is taking place on one site that is comprised of 4 adjacent parcels, does that automatically make it multiple sites?
I believe so. Again, we're looking for, I think on that diagram, in fact, let me just go back. I think in general, we expect that if there's multiple parcels involved, bear with me here. If you got multiple parcels, you've got multiple project sites. So yeah, I would say that you would essentially want to treat each parcel as a site.
All right. See if there's any other questions that are going to come in.
And, again, don't be shy. If you can't think of a question or if you're mulling over something right now, don't be shy about asking questions later. Again, we'd rather hear from you at the onset of your project. And, with the presentation being recorded, you will have the ability to go and look at the recording and go back to a certain part of the grant process to kind of refresh your memory. I do encourage you to get to know the Urban Nonpoint Source grant webpage if you haven't already. That's where you went for your application. But go to each of those tabs and those buttons and look at the resources that are out there. I think Whitney's was probably going to share this, but we will share the recording. And we will share the slides. So you'll also have the PowerPoint slides. And I will likely be sending out an email probably sometime next week with the follow-up. Once the recording is finished and ready to go, we plan on sending a link to that, and you will also have the slides as a reference.
Thanks, Corinne. We've got another question here. For street sweeper purchase, what approval is needed prior to purchase?
That's a good question. That's another one of those ones where I have to kind of jump back on the bicycle. You technically don't have plans and specs because you're not constructing a practice. In terms of approvals, I'm trying to remember if you need to have a sweeping plan. Let me get back to you on that. I apologize that I don't know that off the top of my head. But let me refer back to the code in terms of if you have, for some reason, I'm thinking you maybe need to have some sort of, portion of your stormwater management plan that outlines your plans for street sweeping, but don't quote me on that. That's another one. We don't do a lot of them. So bear with me on that. We can get back to you on that.
Sounds good. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in right now. We can hang on for a few minutes, but unless Corinne, you have anything else to say, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, Corinne, for doing an excellent job and providing all this great content. Do you have anything else that you wanted to share?
No, I appreciate everybody, Whitney and Michelle and Joanna for helping with this, and glad that so many people participated and attended today. And I look forward to working with all of you on administering your grant and getting those reimbursements out the door and the funding sent your way. So thank you.